At the end of the previous lesson, what we did was talk very briefly about the concept of historical materialism, this view of how history develops under a Marxist conception of society and socialism. This lesson is going to explain historical materialism in a lot more detail. Now, I would say that personally, I find historical materialism to be the most difficult to understand element of Marxist thinking. Maybe labor theory of value is also a little bit touchy. At least when I was at university studying Marxist thoughts, Marxist ideology, historical materialism was something that was always a bit of a confusing element to me. So don't be alarmed or feel as if that you don't understand this just yet. Just take your time, of course, and just try and think about this slowly, and I'll try and explain this in as best a way as I possibly can. You might find it particularly easy, and all power to you. So, historical materialism is something known as a mode of historical analysis. So it's a way of trying to explain how history happens, how history develops, how history is moved, how it pushes forward. What are the kind of dynamics that exist in the making of history and historical events? Now, there are various different ways in which you can understand dynamics of historical events. You could subscribe to things like the sort of great man theory of historiography, the sort of view that what drives history forward, what drives things going through it, this idea of great men, the idea of like monarchs and generals and all these different things, and that these are the kind of real key impetus moments that lead to the dynamics of history moving forward. What makes a historical event happen is the sort of decisions and the whims of great men. You could always expand this if you wanted to and say to a more to a less sexist interpretation of history, which is a sort of great people historical analysis, which argues that it is great people, men or women, that really drive that drive historical events forward. Others argue that history develops through societal elements, or maybe through economic conditions, and that it is the economic conditions that leads to historical events. Others talk about geography as being a real key element of historical analysis, talking about where people are and the geography of those regions having quite a lot of impact on how the history of that region develops. Things like natural disasters, for example, famines and floods that lead to events that really, really take shape. And what I mean by these things is, if we take an illustration of something like, most historians argue that the peasants' revolt that takes place in the medieval period in England would not have happened if it wasn't for the Black Death. And they argue that the reason for this is because the Black Death reduced the population so significantly in Europe that it led to peasants having more value economically, owing to the fact that their labour would count for more because there was less of them. And so the sort of supply and demand of labour in the sort of medieval period led to peasants being able to control and command more authority in the region, leading to a peasants' revolt. That's an example, what I've just cited here, of how the idea of pandemics, of natural disasters, and in conjunction with that economics, how these things sort of lead to the dynamics of historical events taking place. So this is really what I mean when we talk about historiography and historical analysis. Historical materialism is one such way of analysing history. But instead of analysing history as sort of a great man theory of history, or even a geographical understanding of history, or something like historicism, what materialism suggests is that historical analysis should be positioned in a way that examines the dynamics of opposing forces which are in conflict with each other. We can understand history and the moving of history, the moving forward of history, as a struggle between contending groups within society. This is something that apparently has occurred, according to historical materialism, throughout all of society. These opposites, to use the Hegelian terminology, these dialectics, are created by relations of production under capitalism. but also existed prior to this. You had the feudal lord and the serf. You have the slave and the slave owner, as these are the sort of ways in which economic production takes place, and that history moves forward. And it is a story of opposing forces. It is a story of dialectics, sometimes known as dialectical materialism. And the materialism aspect relates to the understanding of the relations of production. It is a relationship. It is an opposing relationship between those who own the means of production on the one hand, and those who do not own the means of production. Means of production, the means of production of the things that lead to the creation of things. So, for example, in a factory, there are lots of different means of production. So if there was a factory making phones, for example, there's all of the equipment that is used to create the phones, all of the machines that are used to create the phones. There's the raw materials that are used to create the phones, the sort of the glass and the electronics and all this sort of stuff. These are known as means of production. And another such one of the means of production is labor. You can't make a phone without somebody putting some work into that phone. And so this is what I mean by means of production, the things that create things, okay? According to Marxist historical materialism, the bourgeois are the people who own the means of production, the owner of the factory, if you will. The proletariat are the people who do not, who work the factory, okay? Who, in order to make a living, they sell their means of production. They sell their labor in order to get a wage, and then that labor is then utilized along with the other means of production to create value for capitalists, to create value for those who own the means of production. The proletariat, like I said, survive through the sale of their own labor and to those who own the other means of production. A Marxist understanding of socialism would be a society where workers owned the means of production. So rather than this sort of sale going on, which Marx actually believed to be quite a significant immorality, the sale of your own labor alienates you from your labor. It alienates you. It separates you from the fruits of your labor. And so the result of this is that, according to Marx, this being something that is inherently bad, there should be a situation where the workers actually owned all of the means of production. Why do we even need the bourgeois who own the means of production? Why can't we just take the means of production ourselves? Now, this is all inherently tied into various other elements of things related to things like labor theory of value, things like alienation, as I've mentioned, things like class consciousness, ideology, etc., etc. And the means of production and the relations between them, between those who own it and those who do not, create contradictions between the existence of the class structure. As such, what a socialist revolution seeks to do is overthrow the state and take over the means of production. And this would be necessary for the transition into a communist state or into a socialist state, because Marx doesn't really delineate between the two. Marx describes this transitionary period, however, as the dictatorship of the proletariat. If the workers own the means of production, both the class structure and the system of exploitation will fail, and it will eventually fade away, which is what Marx describes in this view of a dictatorship of the proletariat.